Hey there. There are so many exciting things coming to Walt Disney World in 2019 and beyond. And there are a lot of questions about rumors that are flying around for all four parks. Tim Grassey is back to talk about everything that's going on at Walt Disney World. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 57 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. It's a weird time at Walt Disney World here in late 2018. There's a lot of excitement about Galaxy's Edge arriving late next year and even earlier at Disneyland. Looking ahead, you have TRON, the Magic Kingdom, Guardians of the Galaxy, Ratatouille, so much coming. But the attendance isn't that great right now. Some people are holding back. There's a lot of negativity in terms of ticket increases and more complexities and everything else. So in a way, as a theme park fan, beyond Disney World even, there are so many cool things that we're seeing on the horizon. But I have that little voice in my head that says, will I be able to afford any of these things? Is the investment of hundreds of millions of dollars into these attractions going to lead to something truly amazing? It probably will. If you think about recent additions like Pandora and Cars Land, Disney has gone beyond what I expected from a certain type of land or concept. Expectations are so high for Galaxy's Edge, I'm not sure that would be possible, but it wouldn't shock me that there are things in that land and with the other expansions that go beyond it. So with so many different thoughts flying through my head right now about what's happening, I wanted to talk to a real expert on the parks. So who better to bring in than Tim Grassey of the E-Ticket Report and WDW Theme Parks. He's been on the podcast twice, in episode 19 and episode 38. And so it's fitting, I guess, that I had him back on episode 57. So maybe we should pencil him in for episode 76. I'm not sure. But it was really cool to get a chance to talk to Tim about issues. We go through each of the four parks and talk through some of the big questions about them. And I think it was a really cool conversation that I hope you enjoy. And it's a long one, so I don't want to take any more of your time. Let's go talk to Tim Grassey. All right, well, I am here with a guest who is returning for the third time to talk about what's happening at Walt Disney World. He is a podcast veteran. He's one of the hosts of the E-Ticket Report, and he is the man behind www.themeparks.com. It's Tim Grassey. Tim, thank you for returning to the podcast again.
Thanks for having me back. Now, where does this put me in the echelon? Am I ahead of Len? And I think it was Sam that was the other one that was the multi-time...
Since that point, I've had some decent amount of two-timers. For three-timers, you have Len Testa and Christian Moran, who's an author who's written 2 books and directed a documentary.
Oh, that's right.
So he is at 3 right now, and apparently is writing more books. So he may pass everyone.
Yeah, he's going to go ahead of me.
Right now, you are the 3 at the 3-time guest. A lot of people after 1 or 2 are like, Dan, we've had enough. We're good. We don't need any more. So I appreciate that you're moving past it.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. I always enjoy these conversations.
Of course, it's always a blast. And we focused in the past mostly on Epcot, where there's a lot to talk about with the refurbishment, refresh, whatever. But this time I want to expand it. We will talk about Epcot later, but I figure let's go through each park. Let's talk about a few big issues in each park, things coming up or good, bad, whatnot, just a lot of different things. So, but before we do that, let's talk about a few overall things that I've kind of been thinking about a lot. This is a strange time in the pre-Galaxy's Edge days at Disney World. And I've heard a lot about, soft hotel occupancy and attendance. Now, obviously, the explanation is people are waiting for Star Wars. But from your perspective, do you think Disney should be concerned at all that this is part of some other trend beyond just Galaxy's Edge?
I think that has to play a factor in it, the anticipatory aspect of what's coming in 2019 and actually beyond Galaxy's Edge, which sounds like any expansion to it would be called that. But anyway, so that happens, and Universal saw that when they were building Harry Potter, and it didn't help that they kind of ran those parks at 75% capacity back in the day prior to the Wizarding World debuting. But there is a very real possibility that people have reached the breaking point for a Disney vacation. Those price points aren't cheap. I think Len Testa and Jim Hill on their latest show just talked about a one-day trip into the park, which not many people do, but for a family of four, you're starting at $500 there and you haven't eaten anything yet. So that's daunting. When you factor in hotel prices and food and souvenirs and everything like that, we've been talking about approaching that pain point for people for it seems like a decade now. And it's possible that that's coming to roost. The real test will be next year, really, the reality 2020, when Star Wars Galaxy's Edge is open in its entirety, whether or not it really is just people that are not able to absorb the costs, or if they're just waiting for the next latest and greatest thing. I think it's a combination of a few things.
Yeah, I listened to that episode today, and part of me wishes I hadn't, because it made me kind of sad and a little frustrated, which is sad because I know that they've been raising prices for a while. I know it's an expensive trip. I go into my Disney World trips with eyes open about what they cost and the fact that it'll increase. But when they start to get in, it's seasonal ticket pricing, and it gets so complicated. I'm not here to just complain about Disney on this whole podcast. I promise we won't do that. But there is this narrative. I've talked to family members, I'm sure you have as a Disney expert, who are trying to plan a rare trip, a first trip or a trip they haven't gone in a while. And there's this narrative that it just takes too much effort. So beyond just the cost, when you have these new changes about seasonal tickets and they go different days and it's so complicated, is there a point where Disney's making more money off raising tickets and making it more complicated? But could that money they're making outweigh? It's just a really bad narrative. I feel like it just plays into that whole idea of Disney's too complicated. Why should I bother? Am I thinking too far? Is it a stretch here?
This is something when they first announced the Next Gen project and the price tag was $1 billion or so, I ignorantly said on my former WDW Fanboys podcast, when was the last time Disney spent $1 billion on anything and we didn't get anything cool? I mean, it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment. The infrastructure investment that was made within the last 5 years is all well and good, and much of it is an increased convenience to the guest. But then there are rules that are associated with it that can seemingly be switched with 20 minutes in a programmer that would make things a lot less stress-inducing. I don't know. Have you been to Disneyland? We were talking briefly about this before we started hitting the record button.
I have, but I have not used Max Pass. I was there still when it was paper Fast Passes, which I loved. But I now, the next time I go, I feel like I even am more excited to use the new system. It
is wildly convenient. And having to not worry about what you're going to do 60 days in advance on a Fast Pass is tremendous. And you know that you show up at 9 o'clock in the morning, then you can have your Max Pass you have your pick of anything. Whereas now, 60 days out, your marquee attractions at Disney World aren't available because people are booking them 60 plus 9 days out. It is overly complicated. I think from a pricing standpoint, the seasonal ticketing is adding to that. Dan, I'm going to have you ask me a question and I'm going to answer it for you. So this is, I'm going to give you something to interview me and then we'll just go from there.
Oh, awesome.
So Dan, ask me how much a 10-day ticket costs for Disney World.
Tim, how much is a 10-day ticket at Disney World?
Well, Dan, there are 27 different answers to that question right now. And that is not hyperbole. There are now 27 different answers to that question. And it's largely unnecessary. I suspect, and I hope, actually, that this seasonal ticket pricing is a means to an end that fans are clamoring for, and that's an ending to the 60-day Fast Pass window. I hope. I have no basis in reality that this is the case, other than we were told that the back end of the advanced booking of fast passes was for scheduling. So if that's the case, this would further increase their ability to better schedule staff. And if that eliminates the advanced booking of fast passes, then I am 100% behind the unnecessary complexity of the dated tickets for multi-day tickets. But if this is just another unnecessary complication and there's no ultimate payoff for it, then I wouldn't be surprised if they do away with this, at least from a different pricing standpoint. They could still make date-based tickets a thing. That's not uncommon at other resorts, but they don't price it out on a seasonal basis. I think the swing from day to day is relatively insignificant to them, that it's probably not going to be worth the trouble.
Right. And in a way, it almost seems like the day-to-day thing is a way to mask, like, not to just steal from Len and Jim, but the way to mask the fact that they increase the prices a lot, that the narrative becomes, we're doing this different thing. And I don't want to go through that whole thing because they did a great job on their show.
Yeah, they did a very thorough job.
So listen to
episode
that
184.
But my point is, it's just like, and to get it to your FastPass point, because I don't want to lose that one, I would love if that was the case. My theory is, because we see things too. You're seeing something in Paris, where right now they have, it's not all you pay for it, but there's a way you can buy fast passes. Sure. We've seen it with Club Level, where they're selling a certain number, though it seems like an insane amount of money for a lot of people, but I might consider it if I was on Club Level. And I think it's more likely, the more they build this out and have it be an individual experience, that you're going to pay for fast passes in some fashion down the road. And it's just going to get more, because it seems like, despite the complexity being higher, and yes, maybe attendance is soft, they're still making profits. So I hope it's not the case, but it can be, it almost just says, it sends people, it says, here, Universal, have this. And,
absolutely.
Which I hate that, because I don't want to see them do this. But in a way, it almost feels like it. I'll go stay on site there and just walk on to everything. I can do
absolutely. that. Stay on site at one of their big three that get you the Express Pass. It is a much less stressful environment. I love my wife doesn't go on some of the simulators over there, and Spider-Man counts as a simulator in her mind. So
mine too.
I'll walk on Spider-Man 3 times in a row with the Express Pass, and there's no e-ticket equivalent that you can do that with in Disney World without significant planning, you really can't even game the system anymore. So unless you're finding that random Tuesday in September where everything's a walk-on, it's not really an option. Yeah. So I hope that there's an end game here, and they're seeing where this seasonal ticket pricing will reduce the need for advanced bookings of FastPass. I haven't seen anything Disney has said. I haven't heard a whiff of this. This is purely a hope on my end, not anything that I've heard Disney suggest that they would do. But I understand why they wanted to have the advanced booking for FastPass initially. They sold it as a guest convenience, and in some cases it is, but the reality is it was an internal booking issue or approach for them.
Sure. Yeah, and it's about operations costs too, the ways to have to staff correctly. But before we continue, I do want to go into each park and talk about some other issues. Also, I don't want people to start pulling their hair out and going, the sky is falling. No, we might get to things later that'll do that. All right, so let's start. If we start with Epcot, that'll all be what the show is about. So let's start with the Animal Kingdom first.
Okay.
So the Animal Kingdom obviously had Pandora, which is amazing. I know we talked about that on the last show. And looking ahead, they're making some tweaks. They're doing things with Rivers of Light. We had the Rafiki's Planet Watch thing. But I want to talk a little bit about what we would hope would happen. Because you've heard rumors, and you've put some on your site, about there could be Indiana Jones attraction. There might be a roller coaster in Dinoland. We don't know. There's a lot of different balls in the air with this and Hollywood Studios and such. But if, let's say, someone said, we're putting an e-ticket into the Animal Kingdom, what would you like to see, based maybe on the rumors or on something entirely different?
It's a great question. I think that park is lacking, if you're saying an e-ticket, I think it's lacking indoor attractions. I think it needs an increased lineup there. But I'd almost prefer, and not to say that I'm going to dismiss any e-ticket outright by any means, I'd almost prefer that it gets a lineup of those C-ticket Fantasyland style bus bar dark rides. Things like that to kind of round out the attraction lineup that I think are missing at the non-Magic Kingdom parks. The other thing I would say on the way that the Animal Kingdom is currently laid out now, when you walk into that park, it's not balanced. The left side of that park with Pandora and Africa gets a lot more guests than the right side of that park now. While they very well may be finding a way to get to that plot of land north of Asia with seeing what they're doing with Rafiki's Planet Watch, if they are legitimately going to shut it down or it's going to reopen, as they said, that opens up an area that is the size of the Kilimanjaro Safaris, should they want to use it. But I could also see them saying, all right, we have enough capacity elsewhere in this park. Let's put in an e-ticket over in Dino-Rama area. And I'd like for that to not be another roller coaster. I'd like for it to be a family-friendly attraction, or 2 or 3. If they're going with C-ticket dark rides, then 2 or 3 dark rides in that area would be great. If it's an e-ticket, I'd prefer it to be, we all want to see that Shanghai boat system that they have for pirates out there. I'd love to see something like that. And that doesn't have to be in the Animal Kingdom, but I'm just more fascinated by that ride system than anything. But I want to see a family-friendly edition there.
I agree, because part of me thinks, wouldn't it be cool to have one really killer ride? But that's kind of the trick with the park, is we have enough super headliners. I mean, You got Everest, Kilimanjaro Safaris, Flight of Passage. I mean, you could make a case for Dinosaur. Probably not Navi River Journey, but you know what I mean? You've got enough that are up of that level. What you don't, then you jump down and you have things like Primeval Whirl and, and I love the walking trails. I don't want to see anything change there. That Dino-Rama area, I agree that it seems like, it's not huge. I'm not on somebody who really wants to see them get rid of Dinosaur. I think it's indoors. It's a fun ride. They've done some nice things with the effects to fix some of the issues. It's like, could somehow they connect it, and I hate to just say Beastly Kingdom, but somehow to connect some sort of like dark rides on mythical creatures, and maybe there's some film they could connect it with, I can't think of off the top of my head, or something in that area where you could kind of rope Dinosaur in with those other attractions. That's the thing with that and the studios. I feel like some reason when Disney makes new parks, they just don't seem to have enough rides. It's like, we need more rides. I don't know what it is. I know some of it is money, but rides don't have to cost $200 million.
Well, they do now. I mean, it's kind of the starting point for anything D-ticket or above, unfortunately. And you mentioned Dinosaur, and it's worth noting. It's a 20-year-old attraction, and by that alone, some people will outright dismiss it. But I think it gets a bad rap because Indiana Jones in California is such a good ride. When the follow-up to a ride system with like whatever the new version is, if it's not as good, if it doesn't stand up against the original, then it's going to be downgraded a peg. But if, let's say, Indiana Jones didn't exist and Dinosaur was the only version of that attraction, it would be a pretty spectacular ride. And it is still, but it's now in a park that has had additions since then, and it's, the fourth or even the fifth best attraction in the park. The other thing that I've seen Disney do or kind of fall into the habit of is when they design a park, they come up with themed areas, and those areas, the focus of that theme isn't as broad as it could be, and that makes integrating intellectual property-based things a little bit more difficult, and it makes changing the theme a little bit more difficult because you can't really do it piecemeal. That's one of the unfortunate things that happened with Dinoland USA, where they kind of grafted on Dino-Rama to it. We've all heard the backstory to it, that it's a really cool backstory, but it's still not the greatest idea in the world. So no matter how good the execution is, it's going to look tacky. It is intended to look cheap and mission accomplished, and that doesn't necessarily sit well in a park that is otherwise a work of art. So I don't know what the resolution is to fix that short of removing Dino-Rama entirely. And what they replace it with, if it's another continent or if it's an extension of Dinoland, I don't know. But they're kind of painted into that corner of we came up with a dinosaur-themed area. What do we do with it? And we don't have the rights to Jurassic Park, so we're kind of grasping at straws here to come up with our own original concepts, and we don't do that anymore for the theme parks. So I don't know what the future of that will hold. I don't think it's Indiana Jones. I don't know that there's anything definitive going to the Animal Kingdom right now from a new ride standpoint. I'm sure that there will be in the next 5 years, but I don't think they've decided on anything yet.
And I think that the most likely thing that'll happen is they will in theory, maybe hopefully, we'll fix the Yeti. I think that might be what they actually spend their money on there in the near future, is that they shut that down now that Pandora is doing well, and it might be one reason they decided that they're going to keep Rafiki's Planet Watch open next spring, is they like, well, we need another thing to put people in. And that they also have that Nemo theater. I like the Nemo show, but that doesn't fit in any land. So it's like,
no, it doesn't.
So you could say it's kind of part of, I don't know if it's listed as part of Dino Land or what. And I'm not saying they should just take it out. And I don't have a map in front of me to see how it would all connect, but that is space that if they really got ambitious down the road, like you said, we're probably talking 2023 or something, that they could somehow rope all that together with taking out Chester and Hester's. And one last thing, I rode Triceratops Spin for the first time in a long time last January, and it doesn't have good views. That's the thing that's so weird about it. I know it's supposed to be tacky, but you think of like Dumbo, you have a pretty cool view of the castle and everything, even in the where it moved to. And so I feel like in such a beautiful park, you're looking at nothing. And that's another thing that frustrates me about that area.
With the Nemo theater, and that's been around for as long as ever, so that's been around 12, 13 years at this point. One thing, and again, this is fanboy wishes, not anything grounded in reality. If you want to keep that show, you could have that be an anchor attraction to a small Australia land and put in an animal walkthrough near there. But I suspect that Disney doesn't want to open up a significant new zoological component with actual live animals. I think there is a genuine fear of zoos going away. Or at least animals, the idea of animals held in captivity, with Disney already being the target of anybody's scorn that Blackfish scared them to the extent where they probably don't want to open up any new significant animal exhibits for fear of the backlash. And they've got a relatively clean record with Animal Kingdom, but I think that fear is very much apparent, and any new additions to that park, I would be surprised if there are substantial animal additions to that park in the future.
That's a really interesting point, because you see what's happened to SeaWorld, and they're trying their best to kind of pivot into a different type of park, but it's changed so much. Yeah, if you think about, let's put in Australia and we're going to put in all this marine life or whatnot, that's a big ask. And I agree. I think we have a good local zoo here in St. Louis, but you go to the Animal Kingdom, and I feel like they do a great job with their animal exhibits. I appreciate those trails more now than I ever have. But it does seem like even just rumors coming out like Indiana Jones suggest, whether it happens or not, suggest where they're heading. I have not heard any rumors of a big expansion involving, now we're going to have a big new cheetah area, or a big new I don't want to throw out something and someone will say they're already there, but you know what I mean? That basically something that a koala area or panda or whatever, they're not going to go in that direction, I would think. It's going to be, they might add a new animal to an existing area. I'm fascinated to see what they do, but I agree with you. The odds of anything significant happening, it seems like you may hear a blue sky, but that does seem like something that when the budgets get tight, that they're just going to say, we don't need to do it.
In terms of an animal that would move the needle attendance-wise, your list is relatively short. It's pretty much pandas is it. At a D23 thing, this is probably going back 6 years now. Might only be 4, I don't remember. But I had the opportunity to ask Joe Rohde a question, and I asked him about pandas, and he basically said that as a for-profit institution, the Chinese government is far less willing to discuss it with them. So he said he wouldn't rule it out entirely, but as a for-profit institution, they generally don't license pandas out for display. I wouldn't say it's the door is completely closed on it because they're now off the endangered species list, but it's unlikely. Yes, there's a lineup of other Asian animals that are not really well represented in that park, and you mentioned some Australian animals as well. But I think what's more likely is that they cycle out some of the existing exhibits where you might see new, smaller animals in the Oasis or on the walkways around the Tree of Life. And they have kept the Maharaja Jungle Trek and the Gorilla Falls Exploration Trail relatively fresh with new exhibits, or just making sure that all exhibits have something in them. There will be animals in there for the foreseeable future and probably the next several decades, but just drawing unnecessary attention to a new exhibit might be what they want to avoid.
I hadn't really even thought about that. That's a good point. All right. Well, let's move on to the Magic Kingdom. Speaking of animals, let's move to the Magic Kingdom. Let's do a really bad segue. The big story at the Magic Kingdom for me is that the TRON coaster is coming to Tomorrowland. I'm more excited probably about this than anything beyond the battle attraction at Galaxy's Edge in terms of things that are coming in. And because the thing is, we know what it is. I mean, it may be a little different, but I don't think I would love to say that I'm going to be in Shanghai next year. Probably not going to happen. So when this opens, what is Tomorrowland? Like, what do you think Tomorrowland's going to be like? Because I feel like that corner of the park, not just new attractions, it's going to be so different. So when you think of your mind what that's going to be like with TRON is there, what do you vision for that area?
Well, it is set back enough. So hopefully you've got wide enough walkways. And I do think the attraction itself is limiting in terms of who can actually go on it. What I'm looking forward to is the kinetics that it'll add to the area. And Tomorrowland itself is in need of a significant overhaul. And that's kind of behind the main thoroughfare of Tomorrowland, where it's going. For our listeners that don't know, it's going behind the Speedway. More between the Speedway and Space Mountain. I'm looking forward to the attraction. I haven't been out to Shanghai, nor do I anticipate going out there anytime soon. There are people that have complained about this, and again, not to kind of hit on the negative here, I have really zero issue with this attraction going in. I'm excited to see it. I think people just look at it as it's another roller coaster in the dark next to a roller coaster in the dark, but TRON makes sense for the Magic Kingdom. It should be the most thrilling attraction in that park, and we'll probably get more adults into that park. Not that that's really a problem because they're generally going with kids, but it will be a legit draw for roller coaster fans, which is nice. Magic Kingdom hasn't had a true thrilling roller coaster since it opened.
I'm excited about it. And yes, there is the issue. You could I wouldn't even call it an issue. You could say that it's not this immersive, when you think e-ticket attraction, people are like, well, let's just make pirates into the Shanghai version, or let's do something crazy. Yeah. But really, I wish that TRON was going in where Guardians is at Epcot. Not that I think it's perfect for Epcot, but if you're going to put an IP in.
Yeah.
But beyond that,
I could see flipping them. I think that makes a little bit more sense on paper, but it's still an intellectual property in Epcot, and there's opposition to that in general, but perhaps because TRON, all right, yes, it's based in a fictitious world, but it's a more serious fictitious world relative to Guardians of the Galaxy. Perhaps that's the hurdle. I don't know.
I look at it a little bit like I almost treat TRON now, even though TRON Legacy came out and such, but something like that almost as me as like Pandora is right now, where I look at it and I go, yes, it's based on a movie, but I'm not going to go in there and say, I'm going to be Flynn and I'm going to meet, it almost to me seems like you could call it generic computer sci-fi attraction.
Yeah. The movie isn't getting you to see it. That's not that's not the thing. It's I'm not a big fan of the TRON movies, but I think when you watch those movies, there is an obvious aesthetic there that feels like it fits in a theme park, something that you want to experience. And those light cycle rides are exactly that. To toot my own horn a little bit, I'm going to read something that I wrote a few years ago, and it really kind of hits on something you just said. I talk about how kids gravitate towards what they understand, and that's generally visual motion. But I said, in many respects, adults are the same way. We just gravitate towards different things. In the end, though, we still gravitate towards what we understand. As adult fanboys, we want Beastly Kingdom because we've seen concept art and heard what the attractions would have been. It's a concept that we think we understand. And that's more or less what you're saying with TRON. You've seen what it is, so you've got a better grasp of it. So if there is a Guardians attraction where you were given a full rundown of what it is, or it existed elsewhere, and it was a perfect fit for Epcot, then you wouldn't have said what you just said about flipping those two. There's a bit of an unknown as to what that Guardians attraction is going to be. So there's a sense of uneasiness that was also there when we were talking about Pandora. We minimized Pandora. We reduced it to a ride system we didn't fully understand and called it Soarin' on steroids. And that's a little bit lazy thinking in some way, shape, or form. And this is not me condemning you by any means. It's condemning the fan community in general. Imagineers, Universal Creative, they are the best at what they do. Despite some of the missteps recently, they're still the best at what they do. I come up with ideas, Dan comes up with ideas, and for the most part, it's the equivalent of fan fiction. It's nothing really more than that. We are not Imagineers. I'm an accountant. Dan, I don't know what you do for a living, but I am not a creative person, despite what some of my ideas might sound like. They're not fully fleshed out. They're 1% of an idea. Peter Quill wouldn't even call them 12% of an idea. They're 1% of an idea. And Imagineering does this better. I'm not going to say that Guardians of the Galaxy will be the best ride in the world, nor am I going to say it's the worst ride in the world, because we simply know so little about it. We're reducing it to the smallest version of it, that Guardians of the Galaxy doesn't fit in Epcot, so therefore it is a bad fit. And I'm 100% with you, Dan, but I'm also in a wait and see that there might be an approach that works. There are story treatments that work, and we feared that with Pandora. And the execution of Pandora, the story treatment for Pandora, is as good as anything ever done in a theme park ever.
Yeah. The thing about Pandora that works so well is that the attractions almost don't matter. That's right. The crazy thing. And who knows? Maybe they will set up Guardians where I'm thinking of it only in terms of the coaster itself, which I like indoor coasters. They're fun. But I'm thinking more and not thinking in terms of what if they do some really good pre-shows, or what if the building actually doesn't look terrible? I'm trying to think of the positive side, because really I think what gets our minds rolling is, one, you see that giant building going in that makes Wonders of Life look like my house, and it's just huge, but it's the unknowns, and that's in a way that could be really exciting, because like we've seen, they can do amazing things. Cars Land is really good. Even I have not been on Mission Breakout, but I've heard it's much better than people expected it to be. There is always a chance. I know we've kind of veered away from the Magic Kingdom, but I think it's an interesting discussion. And I'll circle back in a moment. I think worst case, Guardians will be a fun attraction in a weird place, which is not the worst thing. It just seems like an odd way to spend that much money on. If you have to put your cards on the table, what's Guardians going to be like? How successful creatively, beyond the fit in Epcot, just as far as that individual thing, is it going to be like?
I think it will be a very good attraction. The question for me remains, will they find a way to integrate it into whatever Epcot becomes? You talked about the monstrosity of a show building, and to this point, they really haven't themed a show building of that size. At least that's what I thought, until I started seeing BioReconstruct's latest photos of Star Wars Land. And if you see the facade that's going in front of the battle attraction in Star Wars Land, it looks like that's about 150 feet tall. And it's going to be a daunting presence as you walk into that attraction. I don't know for sure that this is going to be anything more than a giant box that the Guardians coaster's in, but if they theme it at all, they could do it there as well. I personally think that sightlines in Epcot have become a lost cause, so I'm less concerned about that as other people. If the ride is good, then people are going to forget about the theme. And they're spending silly amounts of money on this. They're spending silly amounts of money on TRON, on Ratatouille, on Star Wars Land. They know that it has to be good. They know that these have to move the needle. And they're playing catch-up from lack of investments for the last 10 years. So they're betting big on this Guardians ride. This is the biggest thing that they've announced for that park. So I have high expectations for it. I'm not expecting it to be as good as the battle attraction, but it should probably be in the conversation for top 5 rides in Florida when it opens. If it isn't, then it's probably a failure. And failure might be too strong a word, but it's not meeting the expectations that Disney set for it themselves. So I do have high expectations for it.
Right. It can't be like Slinky Dog, where there's an initial, which doesn't have the same expectations, but where there's this initial rush and then the lines settle down to an hour or so, a little more on a busy day, but there's not a buzz about it, where it needs to be something like Flight of Passage at least. We're now coming up on over a year and a half out almost from when it opened, and it still has huge lines and people still talk about it like it's the greatest experience they've had. It needs to be on that level. So that's the thing. When you spend that kind of money, kind of circling back to Tron 2, you spend that kind of money. A lot of people don't watch YouTube videos of Tron.
No.
This is going to be new to them. You spend that kind of money, the expectations are huge. So that's where, and you raise ticket prices. I think they're going to hit them there, but it's going to be interesting. I want to ask you about something related to Tron real quick here, which is the Speedway. So I know they're putting the Speedway under refurbishment. You would think they're going to theme it somehow connected to Tron. So what would you like it? How would you like it to look when that Speedway comes out again later next year?
I don't know. I mean, the cars look every bit 1971 originals. The big thing I don't want is a canopy for Tron that smells like gasoline. That's the big thing that I don't want. I understand that they're closing Speedway after the first of the year, if I'm not mistaken, and then reopening in the summer, I believe was the quoted window. I wouldn't be surprised if that is just to change the footprint of the attraction slightly, and that it reopens without a significant change to the vehicles themselves, the aesthetic of it today. When that reopens, Tron is still 2 years behind it. They could put in electric cars after the fact. They could put in aesthetically different cars after the fact. What I'd like to see is, it's not going to be light cycles on the Speedway, but something that has that aesthetic for the people that either don't want to ride Tron Light Cycle Power Run or aren't tall enough to ride it but can do the Speedway. Something that kind of combines the two so that they make sense together. That's what I'd like to see. But in a daytime aesthetic, that's a little bit harder to do because so much of Tron is either going to be indoors or reliant on the lighting package of it. From everything that we've seen in Shanghai, looks spectacular. Whether they can find a way to carry that over or even extend the canopy over to the Speedway remains to be seen.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, that the Speedway, you mentioned a good point that people might not be able to ride Tron could ride it. It's also right next to Space Mountain, which is another park, another ride that people who are of a certain height or just don't like thrill rides might do. It wouldn't be my first choice to do. I wasn't going to ride Space Mountain, but you get the idea. So I feel like it's more important in a way. I think you may be right because while I would love to say that they're going to completely swap out the cars in that 5 months or so period, it's more likely just to be hopefully not a super reshortening of the track too, because they did that at my local Six Flags park where they put in a coaster and they had these antique cars and they made it like 25% of the length, and it's the dumbest ride in the world. So I really hope it's not going to be that. That's all I will say.
They could do a paint job or a wrap or whatever it is that they have on Test Track right now. And from an aesthetic standpoint, the cars would look more modern, more sleek than they currently are. Something like that would be a step in the right direction, but not a solution. The big thing for me is if they keep the aesthetics exactly the same and they make them electric cars, all right, not my first choice, but still better than the alternative. They need to be electric cars at this point.
Yeah, it seems like a no-brainer. I don't talk to anyone who's like, man, I really hope they don't change that smoky. I mean, the sound is nice, but that's all they're treading on. And the sound actually, when you're trying to have this kind of enjoyable Tomorrowland experience, is kind of jarring. So I don't know if it really fits either. All right, let's move on to Hollywood Studios. Now, I'm going to try not to just go off on Galaxy's Edge forever here because there's a lot to talk about. But in general, you've learned some. Your site keeps track of rumors and various news about Galaxy's Edge. For you, with what you've learned, what excites you really the most about Galaxy's Edge and what it's going to be?
I expect the land itself, you mentioned Pandora, the attractions are almost secondary to the land itself. I expect the land itself to, at the bare minimum, be as good as Pandora, but I expect it to be better. And that's, I say that, I don't take that lightly. I think that's a very substantial component to it. My expectations for the battle attraction are this has to open as the best ride in the world, with little doubt that it's the best ride in the world. So my expectations can't be higher than that. I'm really looking forward to what they do. We've kind of danced around it, that what if people don't care? What if it doesn't move the needle? What if they're midway through construction of the Star Wars Hotel and they abandon it like the first 50 years of Pop Century? If that's the case, but the attractions deliver on an entertainment standpoint and it just doesn't move the needle attendance-wise, I'll be honest, I'm okay with it. Because if I can get on these things in less than 6 hours, sign me up. They're seemingly selling the Millennium Falcon experience a little bit more as the component that's kind of integrated in with the various characters you might experience in the land. And that in itself is cool, but I really have high expectations for this battle attraction. It sounds like it's a combination of all of your favorite attractions in both Disney and Universal. Scott Trowbridge, who is lead designer on Spider-Man over at Islands of Adventure and most of Islands of Adventure, is lead designer on all of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. You have Chris Beatty kind of doing a lot of the theming on it, and I've knocked him in the past for some things that he did in New Fantasyland that I felt were underwhelming, but it's hard to argue with the aesthetics of New Fantasyland, and he's largely the art designer here. So I expect this to look spectacular, and I have very high expectations for the rides.
Yeah, me too. It's weird that part of me just looks at the Millennium Falcon one and goes, yeah, okay, and then moves on to getting excited about the battle attraction, which probably undersells it. When I hear stories about they're struggling to figure it out, and you have 8 people that are playing a game, and I'm looking at it going, oh my gosh, people can't even press the button on Mission Space. How is this going to work? You know, it's like the computer has to do the manual override.
You can have some computer overrides here.
Yeah, which happens every time. So, but you bring up something really interesting about, because, you know, here's Last Jedi. I really enjoyed it. I understand why there's some backlash. Some of the backlash I understand. Some of it I think is ridiculous. Solo. We
can have a separate debate on that.
Yeah, I mean, we could. But just in general, just, you know, let's just say it was disappointing to some. But it still made tons of money. Solo did not make as much money. I thought it was a fun movie, but I went in with no expectations. But
Sure.
You kind of get a weird sense of a little bit of Star Wars overload. Now, maybe that's just with the movies. Maybe that's just because people didn't like The Last Jedi, or the 2 movies came 5 months apart.
Yeah.
But combine the fact that Star Wars isn't as big, and then there's a recession, and Disney has spent all this money. And yeah, let's say, I don't think this is going to happen, but let's say they come in and the attendance goes up a little. Let's say it's like Pandora, actually, where they have long lines, but the park itself, it just cannibalizes the park. That to me is probably worst case scenario. I don't expect to be able to walk on an attraction, though I would love it, like you said. I just don't know if all these things Disney does don't move the needle to where the parks are insane every day. What do they do? I don't know.
We discussed the over-planning component and how that frustrates us. Part of the frustration is that Animal Kingdom, Hollywood Studios, and Epcot don't have the ride lineup that the Magic Kingdom has. And same-day availability for any of your e-ticket attractions is limited at best. When you add more inventory of those attractions to the lineup, that helps. That helps the guest experience. And all right, maybe that means that you still can't get on either of the Star Wars attractions with the same-day Fast Pass, but now some Fast Passes opened up for Tower of Terror or Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway or something like that. The failure question on Galaxy's Edge, we're going to know a good 4 to 6 months ahead of time how well it's received in Disneyland. I can't expect it to fail, because if nothing else, that park needs additional attractions in it. I mean, there was a couple weeks of summer where Hollywood Studios, which has been open for now, at the time, 27, 28 years, had 3 rides open, which is abhorrent. That shouldn't happen in a Disney theme park. And again, this is something we touched upon where they underbuild them for years. This, if nothing else, allows them to say that they've caught up from years where they weren't adding to the parks. They're adding 3 new major attractions to that park next year, which is significant. And I would be shocked if it didn't see a double-digit percentage in attendance increase. But let's say it doesn't. Let's say there's a downturn in the economy for whatever reason, or people are just sick of paying Disney's prices, and it doesn't move the needle. These aren't being built for 2020. They're being built for 2040. These are being built for the next several decades. So maybe in year 1, it's a failure, but eventually they're going to get to the point where they add those additional things to that park and they round it out and it's got 15 to 20 attractions. And these are just 2 and 3 excellent attractions in a more extended lineup. And it's not all for naught. There's a lot of negatives in that sentence. But I think you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
And the next thing in your notes here is about whether Toy Story Land is a success or failure. And I'm not meaning to jump away from Galaxy's Edge.
No, go for it.
Toy Story Land has its faults like anything Disney has done, but it also checks a couple boxes on things that Hollywood Studios needed. It needed a flat ride that's relatively family-friendly. It needed a family-friendly roller coaster to go along with some of the thrill rides that it had in that park. So it checked those boxes. And yeah, it probably didn't move the needle attendance-wise that much, but it's just additional park capacity that was needed. If that's all Toy Story Land accomplished as a bridge land getting you to Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway and Star Wars, then so be it. It didn't have to be Pandora. It wasn't marketed as such. It didn't have to be Cars Land or Harry Potter or anything like that. So I think for what my expectations of it were, it did what it needed to do. It's got a couple of rides that people seem to enjoy, but it satisfies the kiddie component of the park. It satisfies the storybook circus component of the park. We look at these things in a vacuum as to whether a land or a ride is a success or failure. And we really need to look at it as how it fits with the rest of the park. That goes back to what we were talking about with Animal Kingdom, as to the type of ride we want to see added there. Star Wars Land kind of spreads out the different types of rides in that park. I'm looking forward to it. I highly doubt it will be a failure, but if it is, it won't be a failure in the true sense of the word. It would just be a failure from did it boost capacity to the extent that they wanted it to.
Right. And I don't expect it to be a failure. I'm more asking the question just because it's easy for me to just look at it and say, it's going to be nuts forever at that park. So I'm like, well, what if it isn't? That's kind of more like just to ask it as I hate to say an intellectual exercise. I don't want to oversell what we're doing here, but basically just to look at it as, well, it's possible. The percentage is low. But you bring up a good point about Toy Story Land, because it is easy to consider that land on its own merits, and even to look at the ride capacity and say, well, there's not, it's a few thousand extra total. And then there's the shade issue, which they'll fix. When you add it in, plus the third track that they did add to Toy Story Mania, and you look at the whole park, especially given that they got rid of the Great Movie Ride, which held so many people. And you do have to look at it almost like the capacity long term, because yes, once we get Tron and Guardians and Ratatouille, Star Wars will still be super popular, but it may kind of pull that park down more towards how the levels are going to be going forward, barring some sort of Monsters Inc. or some other ride that they add. But I want to transition to Epcot, but this relates to that, because you brought up the point about, those attractions like Galaxy's Edge pulling from other areas. And one of the things that excites me about Guardians and Ratatouille, beyond the attractions themselves at Epcot, is what they will do for Test Track and Soarin'. And even Spaceship Earth, which seems to keep getting longer lines. So what they will do for fast passes in that park. So when both of those are open, and Frozen Ever After to a lesser extent, if it didn't break down so much, I feel like that park, despite having so much, regardless of those two attractions being what I prefer, it should really spread out crowds well in that park. Don't you think that the crowds are going to kind of sift around the way that it really should be when those two open?
Oh, absolutely. You talk Ratatouille and Guardians, and those, I don't know definitively, but I would be hard-pressed to come up with two rides that are further apart within the same theme park that are being added at the same time, but just in general. That's almost like Splash Mountain in Disneyland and the Incredicoaster in Disney California Adventure. I wouldn't be surprised if they're that far apart, but in the same theme park. So that's certainly going to spread the crowds with two new marquee attractions. But in terms of the effect it will have on other things, that's a better question for Len Testa. But I am very much in favor of spreading out the crowds. And I could see the shift, and you're already starting to see the shift in that park, where now Test Track, I believe, is becoming the longest line in that park on a regular basis, even ahead of Frozen Ever After. Because I think the newness, novelty of Frozen Ever After has worn off. Attraction is perfectly good. We've had the does it belong in Norway debate ad nauseum, but the attraction is perfectly fine. But it's a C to D ticket boat ride to Test Track, which is an E-ticket thrill ride. So eventually, once the newness has worn off, people are going to gravitate towards the E-ticket. They're both probably roughly the same level of capacity, so Test Track becomes the bigger draw. The thing that frustrates me as a fan, as a regular park goer, are things like adding the third theater to Soarin', adding the third track to Toy Story Mania, and then continuing to make those same capacity mistakes on major attractions. You mentioned that Flight of Passage is retaining its wait times. Part of that, you and I know, is because it doesn't always operate at full capacity.
Right.
And when it does, even then, that's pretty reduced and probably the lowest e-ticket in Walt Disney World. So when they continue to make those decisions, that's frustrating. Thankfully, it sounds like the 2 Star Wars attractions are at least moderate capacity for Disney rides. Ratatouille should be pretty high. I'm not sure on Guardians. I think Tron is kind of mid to low range. But when you're adding this much in such a short amount of time, that also spreads out the crowds. I also think that they're learning from the mistake that was made in Hollywood studios, that getting rid of Great Movie Ride in favor of Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway was, if nothing else, a capacity mistake. I think with the 2 Star Wars rides drawing people into that park, Mickey and Minnie's drawing people into that park, they're going to want another high-capacity attraction like Great Movie Ride to put people who are otherwise going to be frustrated that they can't get on anything because all of those rides have 4-hour waits. I think they regret that, and I think they're kind of learning that, all right, we're not going to gut Spaceship Earth. We're going to keep that as a flagship attraction for the park, but we're going to make sure that it stands that way. And the rumors right now are a 2-year refurb that are going to be on the heels of the other new additions that are coming to that park and possibly new countries coming to that park, that they're going to make sure that the thing that people have been going to that park for 35 years or 40 years by the time that it's done is as good as it looked on day one, if not better. I think Disney regrets the placement decision of Mickey and Minnie's in hindsight for that, and Epcot might see the benefit of that.
I like that idea because there is a sense, talking about Spaceship Earth, and this is based on, if people don't know, there was a story in WDW News Today, which is not always accurate with their stories, but it makes sense what they've done. There's a story they put out that said that Spaceship Earth is going to go down for multiple years, and the changes up until the Industrial Revolution will be very small changes, like, refreshing and such. And then from there on, they may keep the computer scene, but there's going to be significant enhancements. The dome is going to be, they're going to have new projection effects, which that dome could use. And then who knows what they would do with the descent. It's not clear in the story, but the idea is if it's going to be closed 2 years, they're going to do something with that descent. So, which in one sense you could say, this is terrible. Oh my gosh, they're going to put in characters. In another sense, you could look at it and go, this is great. It's going to stink to have it closed. But like you said, if they spend 2 years and make that something that still fits sort of with the theme in some way, that attraction will be open for another 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that excites me because that's the thing. The Magic Kingdom shows you omni-movers and boat rides with huge capacities are good things. They are helpful. That's what the Hollywood studios or, Animal Kingdom. Just put in an omni-mover that holds 3,000 people. You'll be good. But I know this isn't how they really work because with FastPass, it's changed the game. They don't really do things the same way they used to. But I know that I've rambled a bit about this for now, so I want to get back to asking you a question. But you mentioned new countries. So there's been several rumors about new pavilions in World Showcase. So for you, if you were kind of looking ahead, we've heard rumors about Brazil. We've heard rumors about India.
Yep.
What do you think is going to happen? I mean, could we have both? Are we going to get one? Or is it going to be the same? These are all rumors that never go anywhere.
So the budgets rumored for both Brazil and India indicate not only new pavilions to World Showcase, but new pavilions with substantial attractions to them. Again, the India rumor seems less grounded in reality from all right, yes, they may be discussing this, but no, it's not green lit. That involves putting India in World Showcase with a Jungle Book live action boat ride, likely using the same technology for Shanghai Pirates. The Brazil rumor, I don't know what the ride would be, but the budget seems to indicate that it would be a ride. You're talking $300, $400, maybe even $500 million for a budget. I think we get at least one of them. I wouldn't expect it before 2022. It will be a nice 40th anniversary for that park. They are clearly recognizing that Epcot has its faults, and we've discussed those on previous podcasts. But I think that if I was to bet, I'd say Brazil, as close to definite as it could be, with the only potential hurdle, the political climate in Brazil right now. India seems like the ideas behind that would be redundant, considering Anandapur and to a certain extent, the Everest area, the Circazong area, and Everest, that ride might be better suited for the Animal Kingdom. I would think Brazil is the most likely going to Epcot. And the placement of that is interesting as well. Everything that I have heard, and you've probably heard the same things, it would be that the Brazil Pavilion would be going between Germany and Italy in World Showcase. If you look at Epcot right now, you've got the structure for the Riviera Resort visible between Germany and Africa. And if you have a Brazil Pavilion between Germany and Africa, then the backdrop would make a little bit more sense with the Riviera Resort. But it doesn't sound like that's what they're doing. If India were to go into World Showcase, I would bet that it would go between Germany and Africa because the Shanghai Pirates boat ride, not that that's what's going in there, but a Jungle Cruise equivalent of it, would require a more significant show building. So that is a little bit bigger space. And then you'd have either modern or older Indian architecture with the Riviera backdrop, neither of which would make a whole lot of sense. But again, we've discussed that sightlines in Epcot are less of an issue now in Disney's mind's eye. I think if I was to discount it, I'd say Brazil, probably 90% chance of happening. I'd say India is probably less than 50%, but maybe 40%.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, sure, I would love it if they said we're putting in 2 new countries. But given those budgets, I think they're... And also the rumors for Brazil, beyond the fact that we don't know what the attraction would be, it does seem to make sense. But the political situation, like you said, who knows, you know? It's so hard to gauge how that would work. But it is notable that we don't have a South American country
right
in World Showcase. And we do have, I mean, China and Japan and such. So it would kind of also fill out, I know that's probably not their top priority, but fill out World Showcase more and make it more about the world. And
yeah.
So I think that's big. I would love to see it. And even, you know, obviously we assume that that there will be some connection to an intellectual property with the ride they would put in. I would guess, I mean, you could somehow rope something from like Three Caballeros into it, but then of course there's another Three Caballeros attraction, so that's weird. But there's likely to be some connection in some way. If they do a really convincing country on the level of even what the other countries are with a good attraction, I think I could be okay with it because it would come in as one package. It would not be shoehorned kind of like Frozen was.
And that seems to be the approach now where, I mean, not that World Showcase pavilions are the same thing as a new land, but they're still self-contained in that respect. That makes it a little bit easier when you have the concern of not having broad enough themed areas to allow for appropriate expansion. I think Brazil is happening. As I said, I probably expect it in 2022, 2023 timeframe, but I would be surprised if it doesn't happen, and I would list the current political climate as the reason for it to not happen.
So the big elephant in the room with Epcot, I want to make sure we hit on this before we finish, is Illuminations Reflections of Earth. There was the announcement. This is not a rumor like a lot of the things we've discussed. Disney has given a really vague announcement that next summer they're going to have a new show replacing Illuminations. A small part of me is intrigued about the new show, but a large part of me is concerned. So here's my first question for you, Tim. What is the % chance this new nighttime show will not have Disney characters in it?
5%.
There's a chance though, right?
There's a chance. I may be too generous with my 5% though. I think it is very, very likely to have characters in it in one way, shape, or form. Some way, whatever the phrase is that I just butchered. You know what I meant. There's a very good chance that there'll be characters in it. Given
that fact, let's assume that it's a spectacular show, but it involves Ratatouille and Anna and Elsa and, you know, the ones that are in the countries. Are you excited about it at all? I mean, what do you think it's going to be like? What are your feelings about it?
Put me in the cautiously optimistic category. Illuminations is my favorite show, my favorite nighttime show at Walt Disney World. And I think that I've said this and gotten backlash for saying it. For me, I think Illuminations is more important to that park than Spaceship Earth. Not to say from an icon standpoint, but just from the actual, the bones of Spaceship Earth, the ride, I think is less important than Illuminations. I think it's because Illuminations, the current story of it, while not necessarily understood by all, is still a unifying message of creation and bringing all world cultures together. That in itself is important. My fear is a reduction of that concept. So you can bring in characters into that and have those characters help tell that story. When the D23 Expo came out where they talked about overhauling Epcot, they said a few things that scared me, and you quoted some of them on the last show about the countries around the world and the stories they inspire being brought in. And we see that with Frozen. We see that with Ratatouille and speculation on Coco, which seems to have dissipated. But you see characters that would fit into the various countries and world showcase. And if they can be used in a way where it's still all about a global community as the underlying story to it, and a lot of things blow up and it looks pretty, then we're probably going to be fine. The world isn't going to end because Illuminations changed. This is a very high bar to get over with replacing Illuminations. I think that the original show, the show that's running right now, not the original show, but the show that's running right now is almost a perfect show in my mind. And people complain that it's got its down points, but if a show is nothing but peaks, then you're not really building to anything. I believe that this is a perfect show, so it's a pretty high bar to get over. But I also know, as we said before, Disney is the best at what they do. And excluding Rivers of Light, they pretty much do these nighttime shows better than anybody outside of the Olympic Planning Committee. I mean, these things are generally impressive, and for something that's being put on every night, the expectations have to be high, and they generally hit them. So that's why I come off with cautiously optimistic, that it's possible to do things with characters. The future of Epcot will have characters in it. And if they find a way to integrate those characters in a way that's appropriate to this show and to World Showcase and to Future World, and it's something that ties everything all together, and this is the bow on the end of the night that puts it all together, then I'm for it. I don't know how they're going to do it. I'm not getting paid to figure that out. But I do think that they recognize how important this is. By giving enough lead time, they don't do that normally. They announced probably a year ahead of time when Illuminations was going to close. And I think they recognize how much this show is beloved. And it might be, of things that they've closed, the first time Disney has realized how much these things mean to people. And that's a little bit refreshing, even though they're changing it.
Yeah, I agree. Because you think about when they closed, and these are not comparable, but when they closed, for some people they are actually, Great Movie Ride and Ellen's Energy Adventure, and they were like, this is going to close in 3 weeks or something really short. And a lot of people, I would have loved to have ridden the Great Movie Ride again. It wasn't even my favorite attraction. I thought it needed some help. But even Ellen I would have enjoyed to ride because I hadn't ridden in a while. As an example, they may have learned something from that, because for those attractions to get that kind of response, and like you said, Illuminations, I mean, I think about like what would be a good day at Epcot. I could see going to the park, grabbing food and drink at World Showcase, watching Illuminations, going home, and I'd be like, that was worth it. And that says a lot because it's not cheap to go there. But that shows how important that show is, because it fits so well. And I think back to I was younger, but the previous version of Illuminations, where it was before the millennium and everything, where they did do more of, they would spotlight individual countries. And I'm not sure if you ever saw it, but they had music playing from each country, and I thought that was kind of cool. So I don't think they're going to go back to that, but I could envision something where, unfortunately, like you say, they don't do as much with the kind of creation of Earth and all of that, and do more of the focusing on each country and their characters, but then kind of spotlighting them in a way that still unifies it. That would not equal Illuminations, but I think it could make sense. I just hope that the music is good, because for me, to use Soarin' as an example, and Bruce Broughton, who did the score for Soarin' Around the World, was on the show, and his music's great. But for that example, even though the music's kind of similar, it feels a little bit off in the new version. And I just hope Illuminations, which I think Illuminations soundtrack is so important to the show, and I'll listen to that soundtrack at home. And I just hope that they can find a way. Let's say they do great. You can do great fireworks and all that, but if you don't combine it well with the music and everything else and the fire and the whole deal, it's not going to be the same. And I'm not real negative on it. I just hope that, because I like Rivers of Light a lot. And I know that we're not going to get into that because I've defended it probably too many times. But the fact that they even can do something that I like as much as that gives me hope that with something like Illuminations, they will do even better and can make it great. That's my hope, at least.
If you like Rivers of Light, I don't think you're going to be too disappointed by Illuminations. But that kind of touches upon the opposite side, and I don't want to get too deep into Rivers of Light, but that one tried to look at the calm, serene, whatever word you want to use for it, the valleys, though, of some of the other shows and make an entire show on that. Whereas, say, Happily Ever After is largely the peaks, and a show like that for the Magic Kingdom seems to work. But a balanced show is what I want to see in Epcot, where you have those moments of almost introspection in Illuminations. And I'd like to see something similar to that, where you have, those peaks and valleys throughout the 12 to 15 minute experience, with music that makes sense going from aspect of the show to aspect of the show. So I love Illuminations. We talked before the show started about my hope that I can see the old version and see the new show on the same trip when it happens at the end of next summer. But I'm cautiously optimistic about it. But I know that there's a lot riding on it, that if the show is a miss, they've got to make up for that in other ways around Epcot, because it is a very important conclusion to a lot of people's nights.
Right, and that's been the case even going back to the kind of weird laser version that I remember seeing as a kid with the green lasers. It's still like it really hits off because of the way the lagoon is shaped and everything. You get the sense everybody's around the lagoon. You're all having this experience together. You even to me don't have that experience in the Magic Kingdom or Hollywood Studios or even with Rivers of Light with the amphitheater. There's nothing like standing around that lagoon with who knows how many thousands of people seeing that show. So
it's a great environment for it.
Yeah, it's perfect. I mean, it's basically. So I want to finish with one more question, just generally about Epcot. We spent probably multiple hours in the last few podcasts we've done talking about Epcot and its theme and everything. We've hit on some of that here. But looking ahead, we've heard a lot about, we saw that weird picture that I don't want to think too much about because it's probably, they never released it again, of the image of all the water and all that. But there's been stories, again, Jim Hill and Testa, about doing some sort of crazy fountain that goes like 100 feet or crazy stuff. But beyond all that, just looking ahead for Epcot's next, up to the 40th, let's say, what interests you? Is there something with it that gives you more hope than maybe we had even when we talked early this year, or that maybe we're just not seeing that Disney actually could be flipping the narrative a bit? Or have you seen any indications that something that's going to surprise us that you're excited about?
So the last time we spoke about Epcot, it was wildly pessimistic. And I don't want to say that the future of Epcot is going to be perfect and it's going to revert back to what it was in the 80s and early 90s that fans grew to know and love. I don't think that's realistic. And I think people need to understand that Epcot Center is dead. What I'm hopeful of, though, is that they find a way to differentiate it from the Magic Kingdom, from the other parks, and find a way to make it work. And if nothing else, it's going to be a collection of good attractions. That, I think, is the worst case scenario, because they are spending money in it. We've talked about a few different projects that are silly amounts of money. Ratatouille is north of $200 million. I've heard numbers north of $400 million for the Guardians ride. The World Showcase Pavilion editions could be $300, $400, even $500 million as well. That is ridiculous sums of money that are being spent. And I go back to the ignorant thing that I said about Next Gen. When has Disney spent that kind of money and not resulted in something cool coming from it? So if nothing else, it should be a collection of good attractions. But as for what I am a little bit more optimistic about is that the way that they've done World Showcase, even with character additions that don't seem to fit, and I'm looking at you, Frozen, they've kept the aesthetic correct. And we've hit on new lands like Pandora and soon-to-be Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, where the land itself tells the story. I'm looking forward to walking into a new World Showcase Pavilion, even if I couldn't care less about the attraction. If I get the chance to explore, an acre or two of Disney's take on Brazil or India over and above what's already in the Animal Kingdom, that in itself is intriguing. And when they're now starting to talk about new World Showcase editions, as opposed to just making changes to Future World, That's what gives me a little bit more hope that they're looking to do more than just address the front half of the park. So they're spending a lot of money. It might be poorly placed in some people's eyes, but I think that ship has already sailed. If they're investing into that park with significant additions, I've got to at least be somewhat optimistic about it. I might not necessarily like the step away from what Epcot used to be, but I don't think today's audience would really gravitate towards that much either. So I don't know what the answer is that I would like from a 100% revert back to Epcot Center standpoint, but this is at least a direction for the park, and I don't think it's had that for 15 to 20 years.
I agree, and the one nice thing, too, about them possibly adding a new pavilion is it's actually, I mean, Ratatouille is this way, too, but there was a stretch of time when what they were changing was, like, you know, take out Energy, put in Guardians, take out Maelstrom, put in Frozen, you know, rehab Test Track, rehab add a theater. It was all just substitutions. And now it's like if they actually do a full new pavilion, even with Ratatouille, it's new because they're not taking out Immersions to France. If they had a whole new pavilion, it's like, okay, now we're talking. This is a new thing. This is not just replacing with something that's actually not as good. So I'm excited about that.
They're going to do 22 to 25 years of piecemeal substitutions. And then from there, for the most part, Guardians is the last of that. Yes, ultimately in time they've got to replace Imagination, but the next few additions to that park are likely going to be you've got Ratatouille, and then a couple of new World Showcase pavilions, possibly rides added to existing World Showcase pavilions. UK Pavilion has a Mary Poppins ride that's been rumored for a little bit. So it sounds like what's on the docket for Epcot in the 2020s are additions, not substitutions, not those piecemeal changes that are marginal updates. It sounds like it would be increasing the attraction lineup, increasing the pavilion lineup, and that in itself is intriguing.
I agree. Well, Tim, this has been awesome. I could do this all day. If people want to learn more or hear more from you than even this podcast or more, where can they go online?
So I do maybe once a month or so podcast with Derek Bergen and Chris Wakefield called the E-Ticket Report. We have a Facebook group as well, facebook.com/groups/E-Ticket Report. I have my own website, wdwthemeparks.com. And the last time we spoke, Dan, we talked about another podcast that I was working on called Marty Called, and that kind of fell by the wayside for a little bit. But I'm pleased to announce here that we are going to be bringing that back. Josh and I are sticking around. Gary is not. I still love Gary. He's one of my best friends in the theme park community. But he agreed, and we agreed as well, that he probably wasn't the best fit for that show. So I won't tell you who the new co-host is that's going to be joining us, but it is somebody that Disney podcast fans will all be very, very familiar with. So I'm looking forward to that coming back probably in November or December. And that is an Imagineering-based podcast.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed what you guys were doing with re-recording or basically reimagineering the Carousel Progress. So yeah. I am excited to hear that because I only learned about this really recently. So as in today. so that's really cool, and I'm intrigued by who the third person will be. I will clarify it is not me, which I know everyone would be excited about that, but I'm just kidding. But no, it'll be great, and I love the E-Ticket Report, and it was a blast to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being on.
Always a pleasure, Dan. Thank you.
Well, that was great. If you enjoyed that conversation, you should definitely look back to episodes 19 and 38, where Tim and I focus more on Epcot and its changes over the years. You should also go to tomorrowsociety.com. I recently wrote up my top 10 favorite attractions at Walt Disney World. That was a very tough list to put together. You can also reach out to me by email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or contact me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc, or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music is written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. If you'd like to help out the show, there's a few great ways to do so. You can go to tomorrowsociety.com/support, or you can leave a rating and review on Apple Podcast or whatever podcast vendor you use, which helps out a lot. Next time, I will be speaking with Brian P. Miles of the Retro Disney World podcast about his background and the fun early days of the Walt Disney World Resort. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you again very soon.